You guys know that Mexico is potentially more dangerous to the United States than Russia or China could ever be, right? This was one of the central lessons of the early 20th century. And I'm afraid that US elites, from Republican senators to the New York Times opinion page, may be forgetting this important lesson.
Ben, listen. Let's not get caught.
What are you talking about?
Let's keep going.
What do you mean?
Go. Hurry!
Over the past couple years, as Russia and China have been Thelma and Louising it off the stage of meaningful geopolitical action, I've become more and more convinced that we are at the start of the second American century. The main risk for the United States, as it has been since the 1950s, is that the military-industrial complex will drag us into another pointless war on somebody else's turf where all of our massive advantages will be meaningless. With a column last week, it became clear that that military-industrial complex, personified by Brett Steffens, the war-happiest of New York Times columnists, is turning its eye towards Mexico. That's insane. The U.S.'s greatest defense from Washington, D.C.'s stupidity has always been the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. When we kept France's war in Vietnam going from the 1950s to the 1970s, it was Laos and Cambodia that suffered, not us. When we destroyed Iraq, Libya, and Syria in the first decades of this century, it was Europe that had to deal with the refugee and Brexit consequences, not us. If we destabilize Mexico, a country that shares a nearly 2,000-mile border with the United States, the story will be very, very different. Now, in the 19th century, we didn't have this danger. Before cars and before transcontinental railways, when Mexico was significantly more remote from the United States than Afghanistan is today, we were able to screw with Mexico quite successfully. In the U.S.'s aggressive war against Mexico between 1846 and 1848, U.S. President James K. Polk stole away much of today's western United States. There wasn't really much blowback from this because back then, like the US, Mexico was still kind of an embryonic state with a history shorter than a human lifetime. The Mexican territory the US stole was not as empty as we like to pretend. There were serious populations and even cities, but their loyalties to Mexico City were tenuous, and Mexico simply didn't have the money necessary to tie these remote locations in more closely. So in the 1840s, the United States didn't just get away with messing with Mexico unscathed, we profited massively. That was not the case 70 years later when we intervened to make the Mexican Revolution worse. We got burned, and we got burned badly. Porfirio Diaz, the Mexican president who ran the country almost uninterruptedly from 1876 to 1911, deserves his bad reputation. He was a dictator, and his holding on to power set the stage for the bloody revolution that killed over 1 million Mexicans between 1911 and 1920. But Diaz also did a pretty good job at raising the stakes for any U.S. invasion. Diaz built railroads that knit the country together, bringing the country from a few hundred miles of track in the 1870s to over 15,000 in 1911. The rapacious capitalism Diaz encouraged built revolutionary pressures, but it also made the country a lot more powerful, building a much more consolidated and nationally conscious country on the other side of the U.S. border. When Diaz's dictatorship dissolved into the long-suppressed revolution, the United States thought we could push the country around as easily as we did in the 1840s. We were very, very wrong about that. In the initial stages, though, the Mexican Revolution looked kind of like the U.S. Revolution, except it was much calmer and quicker. After just a year of chaos and some fighting, Mexico found itself with a democratically elected president in November 1911. Francisco Madero was a lot like the men who founded the United States. He was a massively wealthy beneficiary of the previous system who wanted rule of law, less corruption, and maybe a slightly better deal for the Mexican people if it didn't cost the wealthy too much. He also wanted a little more independence from the United States and other foreign powers. He was no fire-breathing revolutionary, but we killed him anyway. At this point, I would like to introduce the worst diplomat in U.S. history. Henry Lane Wilson wasn't just a criminal. He wasn't just in bed with Mexican elites who wanted bad things for their country. Sadly, those two traits are disturbingly common among U.S. officials abroad. No, what made Wilson the worst ever is that he's probably the only U.S. diplomat you can point to who is directly responsible for a foreign invasion of the United States. President Madero had many problems beyond the U.S. ambassador. He was a boring centrist, trapped between socialists who wanted more revolution and the old elite that was constantly trying to murder him. But Ambassador Wilson was probably Madero's single most powerful enemy. Wilson organized the international media and diplomatic world against the new Mexican government. After Madero survived at least 2 right-wing uprisings against his rule, Wilson decided to actively assist a third. The power-sharing agreement for the new government was hammered out at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City. Wilson knew about the timing of the coup before it happened, and most historians agree that Wilson gave tacit U.S. approval to the murder of Mexico's democratically elected president and vice president after they were already in custody. With this coup in early 1913, Ambassador Wilson helped turn a fledgling democracy into a military dictatorship under Victoriano Huerta, a man who went on to become one of the most loathed figures in Mexican history. And by consenting to the murder of a democratically elected president, Ambassador Wilson helped to turn the Mexican Revolution from a 2-year thing into a 10-year thing. Ambassador Wilson actually created the radical revolutionary mess that he had accused President Madero of overseeing. When the new U.S. president, confusingly also named Wilson, realized what the ambassador had done, he quickly removed him. President Wilson was a famous racist and imperialist in Latin America, but even by his standards, what the ambassador had done was way out of line, and he had to be removed. Unfortunately, the damage had already been done. Mexico's chance at steady, moderate reform had been killed by U.S. meddling. The 7 years of chaos that ensued were horrible for Mexico and humiliating for the United States. On March 3, 1916, an invading army attacked the United States for the first time since 1812. Pancho Villa's rebels were quickly turned back, but a Texas town was destroyed. The year-long U.S. punitive expedition to Mexico that followed failed to find Pancho Villa and made the United States look ridiculous as World War I was raging in Europe. The military consequences were dire, but U.S. politicians probably cared more about the economic and domestic effects. The revolution shut down almost all business between the two countries for a full decade and required expensive and corrupting security measures in all of the U.S. border states. In response to all of this disaster, the United States did something that it almost never does. It learned a lesson. 10 years of chaos showed that Mexico was just too close to screw with the way we screw with everybody else. No matter how much more powerful we are, a nearly 2,000-mile border means Mexico can hurt us in ways that nobody else can. So for 100 years, we've arguably respected Mexican freedom more than anybody else's. In 1938, the Mexican government nationalized its oil industry, expropriating the assets of a bunch of powerful U.S. companies. And the United States did nothing. In most of the world, the CIA is a pretty useless organization. But it's different in Latin America. Most American countries have a racial hierarchy that is very similar to our own. And most of them have white elites who are eager to use U.S. resources to hold on to power. So throughout the Cold War, the CIA was able to install anti-communist military dictatorships almost everywhere south of the border. Any Latin American politician that dared to talk about land reform or even taxes on US companies was risking his life. But not in Mexico. From 1929 to 2000, Mexico was a one-party state. Incredibly, throughout the Cold War, Mexico was governed by the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. So the United States government that spent 50 years murdering any milquetoast Central American centrist or Catholic priest that said anything vaguely left-wing just ignored the institutional revolution south of its border. Because Mexican stability is really, really important to the United States. It was so important that we wouldn't let our idiot Cold Warriors get anywhere near it. To be clear, the United States was definitely involved behind the scenes. By the 1970s, or certainly by the 1980s, we had comprehensively bribed any revolution out of Mexican elites. But we were always really careful about it, because we had learned how dangerous Mexico could be if we stuck our noses in too far. And of course, there's the whole matter of US drug laws. Without the lunacy of US drug enforcement policy, Mexico would probably be as developed as Poland, or at least Turkey is today. But that's a very complicated subject we don't have the time to get into in this video. For nearly a century, the United States has been smart enough to treat Mexico differently, because we learned the lesson of the Mexican Revolution. But I fear we may be forgetting that lesson. A century later, we are beginning to get US political figures who seem to want to follow in Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson's footsteps. Tom Cotton, one of the US Senate's most abject lackeys of the defense industry, has been suggesting a US invasion of Mexico for years now. Thankfully, nobody takes Tom Cotton seriously. What's more worrying is the fact that Brett Steffens of the New York Times opinion page, a military-industrial complex mouthpiece that a disturbing amount of people do take seriously, now seem to be on the destabilized Mexico bandwagon as well. The November 22nd article, "Will Mexico Be the Next Venezuela?" may seem reasonable to US readers. I have some complaints about Andrés Manuel López Obrador as well. The Mexican president, commonly known as AMLO, seems to be pretty bad at his job. But countries sometimes have bad presidents. That's how democracy works. What Steffens does in this article is further the process of demonizing AMLO and making him personally responsible for Mexico's many problems. This is most obvious on the topic of militarization. The British business publication The Economist has also been talking a lot about AMLO's militarization of Mexico as well. If you have seen any other video on this channel, you know that I'm a huge opponent of the militarization of any country, and it seems likely that AMLO is making this situation worse. But is it really just about the current Mexican president? Do you think it might have anything to do with the massive acceleration of Mexico's war on drugs over the past decade that was heavily encouraged by the United States? Hilariously, in this article, Steffens condemns AMLO both for the militarization and for not drug warring hard enough. He doesn't seem to see the contradiction. What this article is trying to do to AMLO is exactly what Ambassador Wilson did to Mexican President Maduro over a century ago. By making a country's problems all about one man, you create the fiction that if you remove him, that country's problems will disappear. That's never been true. Not in Iraq, not in Libya, not in Venezuela, or anywhere else. But it's a central Washington, D.C. fantasy. Nobody other than Tom Cotton is seriously suggesting a U.S. invasion of Mexico today. But if the demonization of AMLO continues, it's not that hard to imagine a trajectory that would lead to an Iraq or Vietnam-scale war in the Western Hemisphere. Whether it's the CIA, JSOC, the DEA, or some other acronym, the US government could easily destabilize the Mexican political system by forcing the assassination or removal of AMLO. If that happens, the already appalling level of narcotics-related violence might be supercharged by political violence. That violence could then easily spill over the US-Mexico border. Pancho Villa's 1916 raid killed 18 US citizens. It's easy to imagine a scenario where spillover from a destabilized 21st century Mexico kills 18 US citizens a day. If that happened, the pressure for a US invasion of Mexico would become irresistible. So then Texas and Arizona get to be Lebanon and Cambodia. That's a vastly more dangerous scenario for US empire than the loss of Taiwan, Ukraine, and Israel combined. Yet supposedly serious people like Tom Cotton and Brett Steffens are already building the ideological infrastructure necessary for a US invasion of Mexico. Now, I'm not saying that any of that is going to happen or that it's even necessarily likely, but in 2022, it seems like the United States might be running out of enemies. The clownish despots in China, Russia, and Iran that people like Brett Steffens have been tarting up for decades all look pretty vulnerable. We could need a new enemy to help prop up our inflated defense budgets. And the US military-industrial complex is already looking south. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And have I mentioned that I have an email list lately? It's really important that I have the ability to contact you guys if I start losing access to platforms. And the email list can never be taken away from me. So please sign up.